Some stories begin with a choice. Hers began with a hunger so deep it could silence the soul itself. The morning sky had not yet committed to becoming day. It hovered in that colorless space between night and light where everything looked washed out and half-remembered. Fog rolled across the marketplace like a slow, living creature, slipping between stalls and crawling over broken crates abandoned from the night before. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, yet stale with the smell of yesterday's spoiled goods. Myra stepped into the square, with the hesitant quiet of someone who had long learned the cost of being noticed. Her steps were soft, nearly soundless, but her stomach betrayed her with a low, twisting ache. She ignored it. She had ignored much worse in her lifetime. Most merchants weren't awake yet. Their canopies sagged like wilted flowers, weighed down by dew and neglect. Rats scurried between piles of discarded produce, feasting on what even the poorest citizens had refused. Myra scanned the ground, not with desperation, but with the cold logic of someone who had been pushed past desperation long ago. Then she saw it, a loaf darkened, misshapen, rotting along one edge half sunk in muddy water. Worthless to the world. Worth everything to her. She knelt, hands trembling not from fear, but from the quiet exhaustion of surviving one day too many. Her fingertips brushed the bread's surface. It felt damp, soft, unclean. But to someone who had slept on stone floors and scraped her meals from corners, it was still a miracle. She lifted it, a shadow cut across her hands. Putting your hands on that? A cold voice spat behind her. Myra turned slowly. A guard stood there, wide shoulders, polished armor, eyes sharp with a kind of enjoyment that only appeared when he found someone beneath him to punish. His boots splattered the puddle at her knees, staining her dress further. It was thrown away, Myra said softly. It harms no one if I... He interrupted with a laugh, low and cruel. Everything here belongs to the manor. Even the mold. The absurdity of that statement tightened her chest, but she didn't speak. People like him didn't need reasons to punish. They needed opportunities. The guard grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. The loaf fell back into the mud with a soft splash, almost a sigh. By now, a few early risers had gathered to watch. Not to intervene? Not to protest? Just to watch. Their faces were washed-out shapes in the fog, their silences sharper than any blade. She will answer for theft, the guard declared as though announcing a grand crime. Myra didn't resist. Resistance required energy she no longer possessed. Instead, she allowed herself to be dragged through the square, her feet scraping over stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A tightness settled in her throat, not fear she had outgrown that, but a familiar humiliation, the kind that clung to the ribs and calcified over time. At the center of the square, the guard forced her to stand before the watching crowd. He listed her offense with exaggerated drama, making sure every syllable humiliated her. Then came the declaration, 200 strokes of public disgrace. Not described? Not shown. Only felt 200 moments of the world turning its back. 200 reminders that a servant's hunger was a crime. 200 silent blows against her existence. No marks were allowed to be shown, but the emotional impact carved itself into the air, heavy and suffocating. The crowd averted their eyes as though her suffering were an inconvenience they didn't want to acknowledge. When it was done, Myra stood unbroken but hollow, as though the morning fog had seeped into her chest and settled there permanently. The guard released her with the same dismissive gesture one might give to an animal no longer worth attention. Myra did not cry. She simply looked at the ruined loaf lying in the mud. Her voice, barely above breath, carried only to herself. If the world denies even the unwanted, then the world will one day taste its own silence. Humiliation tried to bury her that morning, but beneath the ashes of her suffering, something far more powerful began to wake. Some places promise shelter, but Myra learned long ago that stone walls can hide cruelty far better than shadows ever could. The manor rose at the edge of the city like a mausoleum built for the living. Tall arches, narrow windows, and a coldness that clung to its stones no matter the season. Even from a distance, it felt less like a home and more like a quiet reminder that power thrived behind closed doors. The morning fog had followed Myra here, swirling around the iron gate as if reluctant to let her enter. The guard shoved her forward with a brief, bored gesture. "Your new assignment," he said, almost smirking. As though relocating her were an amusement, Myra didn't look back. The marketplace already felt like a distant nightmare, one that left its echoes in her spine and its residue in the corners of her mind. She walked through the gates with steady steps, though every movement sent waves of exhaustion through her body. Her breath trembled only once. Inside the courtyard, young workers arranged ornaments, stringing lanterns from high beams for the upcoming wedding. Their cheerful voices tangled with the metallic clatter of preparation, table frames being adjusted, crates of linens being dragged across stone. The manor bustled with the kind of energy Myra had never been part of. Celebration, joy, abundance. She walked through it like a ghost. A supervisor approached, a ledger tucked under her arm. "You're the new one, Myra, yes?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just distant, efficient. Myra nodded. "You'll assist in the hall. Keep to your tasks, and don't disrupt the household rhythm. Lord Hadron's daughter weds in 2 nights. There is no room for mistakes." Mistakes! An amusing word for someone whose only crime had been hunger. Myra bowed slightly. "I understand." The supervisor turned away immediately. Myra, already forgotten, already categorized as another replaceable shadow. She was led through winding corridors washed in pale morning light. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes of triumph and harvest images that felt insulting in their abundance. Myra's fingers brushed the stone beside her. It was cold, unyielding, much like the world she had known since childhood. When they reached the great hall, Myra paused. It was vast, filled with high beams, hanging drapes, and chandeliers prepared but not yet lit. Servants scurried across the floor, laying out long tables, polishing metalware, sweeping corners with frantic precision. The air carried the faint sweetness of stored spices and the metallic scent of old stone. And then she saw Elora. The daughter of Lord Hadron stood near the far window, her gown flowing like soft river light. Her smile was gentle, untouched by hardship. Her presence felt almost unreal, too bright for a place that carried such sharp echoes. She noticed Myra immediately. "You're new," Elora said, stepping closer. Her voice was warm, but not pitying, simply human. "You look tired." "Have you been on the road long?" Myra bowed her head. "I manage what I must." Elora frowned softly. "If you need rest, someone can assist in your place. You look pale." Myra's chest tightened, not from gratitude, but from the sting of being seen for the first time in too long, even if imperfectly. "I'm well, my lady," she replied, offering a faint smile that carried no truth. Elora touched her arm lightly. "If anyone troubles you, speak to me." Myra wanted to laugh, not out of disrespect, but from the strange cruelty of kindness offered too late. When Elora turned away, Myra exhaled slowly. The light from the window cast Elora in a glow that Myra could never step into. Her world and theirs identical in place, divided in fate? She returned to work, lifting trays, wiping surfaces, arranging decorations with steady, silent movements. No one asked her name, no one cared where she had come from. She existed only as a pair of hands, moving through tasks with machine-like precision. And yet, the humiliation of the marketplace clung to her like smoke, following her through every corridor. She saw the people here laughing, planning, celebrating. And she wondered, how could the world hold joy and cruelty at the same time? And why had it chosen to give her only the latter? The manor walls towered above her, cold and indifferent. As Myra worked beneath the chandeliers of another family's happiness, a quiet truth settled into her bone-stone walls: do not protect the broken. They simply echo their pain louder. Some rooms feed the body. Others feed the cruelty of those who believe they'll never starve. The manor's kitchen was alive long before the sun bothered to rise. Firelight flickered against stone walls, throwing warped shadows that danced in restless shapes. The air was thick steam, spice, boiling water, simmering broth blending into a heat that pressed against the chest like an unspoken threat. Metal clanged, knives struck wooden boards. Laughter rose and fell like a familiar storm. To anyone else, the kitchen would feel warm. To Mayra, it felt like stepping into the jaws of something that chewed through the weary. Her task was simple: clean, carry, prepare. But the moment she crossed the threshold, the workers turned their eyes toward her with the sharp, curious glances that people reserve for stray animals wandering into the wrong yard. "That's the new one?" a woman muttered under her breath, slicing herbs with unnecessary force. "She's the one from the square," someone whispered back. "The public disgrace girl." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Myra kept her eyes down, moving toward a basin filled with cloudy water. The water's surface trembled from the vibrations of pots slamming onto counters. She dipped her hands in and scrubbed a tray that already seemed too clean. "Look how she shakes," a man said, not bothering to quiet his voice. "That's what happens when you forget your place." Myra didn't respond. Her silence was not submission, it was survival. Words were a luxury she could not afford in rooms like this. The cooks circled around her like vultures who had spotted something weakened. Myra felt the weight of their stares, each one a reminder that the humiliation of the marketplace had traveled with her, settling on her like an invisible cloak. A pot clanged loudly behind her. Myra flinched. A woman laughed. She jumps like a frightened sparrow. Heat rose in Myra's throat. Not anger, she was too tired for anger, but something colder. Something that had begun forming the moment she was dragged through the marketplace. Something that had followed her into the manor and found a home behind her ribs. As she rinsed the tray, she heard the cooks whispering again, their voices low but maliciously clear. 200 strokes. I heard she barely stood afterward. Why would anyone risk punishment over a rotten loaf? Desperation, another replied, shrugging. The kind we don't have to understand. Myra pressed the tray harder against the basin. Their words didn't hurt. Pain requires expectation. Myra expected nothing from them. What stung, what always stung, was how easily the world threw stones at people standing at the bottom. A cook brushed past her, deliberately bumping her shoulder. "Try not to ruin the feast, Myra," he sneered. She steadied herself. "Yes," she answered softly. A word that meant nothing but prevented everything. The kitchen roared on, boiling pots foamed. Knives flashed, orders were shouted. Myra moved through it all like a shadow, careful not to draw too much attention, careful not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Every movement was a negotiation between obedience and the sharp edge of her own dignity, but she listened, the whispers, the tones, the casual cruelty, they etched themselves into her memory with more force than the strokes of humiliation ever had. Because humiliation fades. Understanding does not. She placed a stack of clean trays onto the counter. Her reflection caught briefly on the metal surface, tired, hollow, but not defeated, not yet, and somewhere deep within, beneath the layers of exhaustion and quiet suffering, a single thought crystallized. If they could speak so freely about her suffering, then one day she would speak without fear about theirs. She didn't know what that meant yet. The idea wasn't a plan. It was simply the first flicker of awareness, small, quiet, but undeniable. The cooks continued to talk. Unaware. Myra continued to work, very aware. In the heat and noise of the kitchen, she realized that cruelty was not loud. It was casual. And casual cruelty was the kind that demanded to be answered. Some guidance comes not with warmth, but with the quiet weight of truth. Heavy enough to shatter the fragile illusions of the living, Myra found herself in the back corridor, where shadows pooled in the corners like waiting predators. The kitchen's clamor had faded behind her, leaving only the soft hiss of fire from the servant's hearth and the distant echoes of laughter from the great hall. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion so deep it had begun to seep into her bones. Each step she took felt measured, as though the stone beneath her feet might judge her missteps. A figure emerged from the gloom. Sira, the elderly servant with eyes like dull amber, watched Myra with the patience of someone who had seen too many lives bend and break under the weight of others' indifference. Her face was lined with age, but her gaze carried a sharpness Myra had not expected. Blade hidden beneath the folds of wrinkles, You move as though the air itself conspires against you, Sira said softly, stepping closer. Her voice was quiet enough not to alert any passing eyes, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Myra straightened, brushing invisible dust from her hands. I am accustomed, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sira shook her head. Accustomed does not mean free. You have been measured, punished, and reduced to shadow. You think survival is all you need, but it is only the beginning. Myra's heart thumped. She had learned the lessons of survival long ago: hide, obey, endure. But the words Sira spoke resonated like a bell struck in the hollow hall of her mind. I've endured more than I can name, Myra said quietly. And yet it changes nothing. The world does not notice me, nor will it. Sira leaned closer, her gaze unwavering. The world notices more than you know, but not in the way you imagine. Cruelty and neglect are loud, they echo, but those echoes only return to those who wait, who watch, and who learn. You, child, have seen too much? You have felt too much. That knowledge is power, if you know how to wield it. Myra's stomach twisted. Power? The idea was foreign, almost dangerous? She had spent her life shrinking, bowing, fading into corners. Power felt like a word belonging to others, not her. Be careful, Sira continued. Storms can cleanse, yes, but they can also destroy. You must choose your storm carefully. Let it break the walls of indifference, not collapse into ruin. Let it awaken, not annihilate. Myra considered the words, letting them sink in with a slow weight. She thought of the marketplace, of the crowd that watched her humiliation like a spectacle. She remembered the guard's sneer, the echo of 200 symbolic blows, and the loaf that had once been enough to claim her very breath. A flicker of clarity began to form in the dark recesses of her mind. I do not want to destroy, she whispered. I want the world to know what it is like to see me. Sira smiled faintly. Then do not mistake the storm for vengeance. True awakening does not come from inflicting pain, it comes from making the indifferent hear the silence they created. Myra nodded slowly, feeling a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Intention. Not rage. Not fear. Purpose, a quiet, calculated purpose. She straightened her back and brushed off her dress, feeling the weight of both the morning's shame and the lessons Sira had given her. The corridor seemed darker now, but not oppressive. The shadows no longer felt like predators. They were witnesses. As Myra turned to return to her duties, Sira's final words lingered in the chill of the corridor. Tonight you will choose whether to remain invisible, or whether your silence becomes the voice that cannot be ignored. And for the first time in years, Myra felt the stirrings of a storm inside her, not a storm of fury, but a storm of awakening, quiet yet inevitable, ready to break against the walls of a world that had long denied her existence. Some power is silent, subtle, and unseen, but it leaves marks deeper than any blade ever could. The storeroom smelled of dried leaves and earth, faintly sweet beneath the musty scent of old stone. Myra stepped inside, the wooden door creaking under her touch, as if protesting her presence. Shelves stretched high, stacked with jars and sacks, each labeled with delicate curling script. Herbs, roots, powders, some for cooking, some for healing, some for something else. Myra couldn't yet name the latter. Her fingers hovered over the jars, brushing the smooth glass lightly. Each one held a different possibility: calm, sleep, dreams, forgetfulness. None of them could harm permanently, none of them could destroy, and yet they whispered promises. Not of vengeance, but of balance, a fleeting chance to shift the scales, even if just a little. A guard's voice echoed faintly from the corridor outside. Myra stiffened. No one must see. No one could know she lingered here, drawn to the jars like a moth to light. She inhaled slowly, letting the scents fill her senses: lavender, bitter roots, crushed petals. The room seemed to hum around her, vibrating with a quiet anticipation she hadn't felt since childhood. Her gaze fell on a small collection of powders in clay jars, labeled with strange, elegant symbols. One, a finely crushed mixture of herbs. and blossoms promised deep, dream-heavy sleep and intangible power she could use without ever hurting anyone. She lifted it cautiously, feeling its weight. It was heavy, not in mass, but in potential. A tool for reflection, a lesson without cruelty. A noise behind her made Mara snap the jar back into its place. A young cook peeked in, eyes curious, a brow raised. "Looking for something dangerous, servant?" Myra's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing that could harm," she replied, voice calm but sharp. She stepped back, placing the jar securely on the shelf. The cook left with a dismissive snort. Myra exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. She understood now that the jars represented more than sleep or calm. They were a symbol of what she had never been allowed: agency, choice, a way to act without being seen, to influence without violence. She lingered a moment longer, tracing the labels with her fingertips, imagining what could happen if she applied even a fraction of this subtle power in the right moment. It was tempting to act immediately, to correct the injustices she had endured, to make the indifferent see what they had done. But something Sierra had said in the corridor yesterday echoed in her mind. Storms can cleanse, yes, but they can also destroy. Let it awaken, not annihilate. Myra closed the jar carefully, placing it back among the others. She realized the first act of her storm was not the act itself, but the awareness, the planning, the restraint. Patience was power in its own right. Her hands lingered briefly on the wood of the shelves. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of morning light cutting through the small window, and for the first time in months, Mara allowed herself to feel that. What she held inside her chest, the quiet fire of determination, was no longer a secret burden. It was a weapon. Not a destructive one, but a clarifying one. She turned to leave the storeroom, stepping softly across the creaking floorboards, her shadow stretching behind her like a companion. In that dim corridor, surrounded by the scents of sleep and dreams, she felt the weight of possibility pressing on her, both exhilarating and terrifying. She whispered to herself as she exited, "I can shape the silence without breaking it. I can speak without harm. They will hear me, even if they do not know why." And as the door clicked shut behind her, Mara felt the first tremors of the storm inside her, quiet, calculated, inevitable, and the world would not recognize the voice rising from the shadows until it was already too late. Some faces haunt the soul long after the body has endured their cruelty. The great hall smelled of polished wood, waxed floors, and the faint tang of simmering broth from the kitchens beyond. Lanterns hung from high beams, their flames trembling in the drafts that slipped through the ancient windows. Myra moved along the polished stones, balancing a tray of fresh linens, each step deliberate, silent, but alert. She could feel eyes on her, though she could not see them yet. And then she did. The guard from the marketplace, the same one who had overseen her public disgrace, was leaning casually against a carved column near the entrance to the hall. His polished boots reflected the light, his armor gleaming like a mirror for the arrogance he carried. He laughed, low and easy, at something another guard had whispered, and his gaze landed on her as though spotting prey long forgotten. "Well, if it isn't the sparrow who fell in the square," he said, voice rich with amusement. "Still picking at crumbs, I see." Myra stiffened. Every muscle in her body tensed, not from fear, but from the memory of the humiliation he had inflicted hours, days, and years ago. The marketplace. 200 strokes of public shame. The loaf that had been all she could claim. She remembered every moment, as though the day had been carved into her soul with invisible knives. She continued to walk, slow, measured, her back straight, her eyes focused ahead. She would not give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "Careful with that tray," he added, smirking. "Wouldn't want to ruin the wedding before it even begins." Myra's hands tightened around the tray. Inside, her thoughts whirled, but her expression remained calm. He does not see me. He sees only what he wants to see. One day, he will notice the wrong truth. She passed the columns, each step echoing in the cavernous hall. The servants bustled around her, unaware or pretending to be of the tension she carried. Laughter and music began to swell as preparations for the wedding feast reached a crescendo. Bright fabrics, Polished silver and fresh flowers contrasted violently with the bitter memory she carried like a second skin. The guard leaned casually against the railing, still observing. Myra's pulse remained steady. This was not a moment for action, it was a moment for observation. Every detail, every pattern of movement, every arrogance displayed, was another thread she could weave into the fabric of her eventual reckoning. A small smile flickered across her face, not triumph, but understanding. The world had taught her to cower, to endure, to remain unseen, but endurance had a limit. Observation had a weight all its own. Even the slightest imperfection, the tiniest lapse in vigilance, could be transformed into clarity, into a subtle shift of power. She placed the tray down carefully and stepped back, never letting her gaze fall fully on him. Inside, her mind raced with quiet, patient strategies, not vengeance, not harm, but awareness reversal, reflection, a way to make the indifferent feel, however briefly, the discomfort they had inflicted upon others. The guard laughed again, unaware of the storm already beginning to gather beneath her calm exterior. Myra did not look at him again. She let her eyes drift toward the preparations, toward the tables, the arrangements, the rhythm of the feast that would soon fill the hall. And yet the memory of him remained, lodged deep, not as hatred, but as fuel. She would act when the moment was precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Until then, she would move like water, silent, patient, unstoppable in its persistence. And as she walked away, the polished stones echoing beneath her steps, Myra felt the first tremors of her quiet storm stirring, an invisible force gathering strength, patient, inevitable, and already brushing against the walls of the indifferent world. Even the brightest lights cast shadows, and Myra knew the glow of celebration could not mask the weight of the world she carried within her. The rain had softened into a persistent drizzle by the time night fell, leaving the manor surrounded by a mist that blurred the edges of reality. Lanterns were lit along the pathways, their warm glow trembling in the damp air, reflecting in puddles like fractured stars. The grand hall awaited, already heavy with the scents of polished wood, freshly baked bread, and the delicate perfumes of flowers stacked in ornate vases. Music flowed softly from hidden corners, weaving through the walls like a gentle tide. Myra moved along the edges of the hall, silent as a shadow, balancing her tray of utensils and polished silverware. Her eyes darted from guest to guest, each face unfamiliar, each smile bright with anticipation. The hall was alive, vibrant, everything she had been denied most of her life. Every movement, every gesture, every light laughter stabbed at the hollow of her chest, reminding her of the distance she had been forced to endure. And yet, amidst the warmth and joy, Myra sensed a dissonance, a subtle tension that the guests were too distracted to notice. The hall was perfect, but perfection carried its own fragility. Elora approached her then, gliding through the crowd with an elegance that seemed untouchable. Her dress glimmered under the lanterns, every movement measured, every gesture graceful. Myra instinctively straightened her posture, a reflex from years of observing others' expectations. "You seem troubled," Elora said, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. She reached out, a hand hovering near Myra's arm. "Is someone troubling you?" Myra looked down at the tray she carried, her grip tightening slightly. "No, my lady. Everything is as it should be," she replied, voice even, careful. Elora tilted her head slightly, studying her. "I hope you know you need not hide here. If anyone," she paused, glancing toward the bustling servants, then back to Myra. "'Cause you harm? You may speak to me." Myra's chest constricted not with gratitude, but with the painful awareness of how little her words could protect her. The offer was genuine, yes, but it was also limited. She existed here as a shadow, a background note to a melody she had no part in. And yet, it was the first acknowledgement she had received in years. She bowed her head slightly. "I understand," she whispered. Elora smiled and moved on, leaving Myra alone with her thoughts, standing at the edge of a celebration that belonged to everyone but her. Myra's eyes swept the hall, guests laughing, families exchanging pleasantries, music floating on the warm air. Everything seemed luminous, unreal, and painfully out of reach. Myra's mind returned to the lessons Sira had whispered in the corridor days ago. Storms can cleanse, but they can also destroy. Let it awaken, not annihilate. She allowed herself a slow inhale, feeling the pulse of the hall like a rhythm she could follow, not yet touch, but understand. Observation was her weapon tonight, patience her shield, silence her ally. She adjusted the tray in her hands, feeling the cool weight of metal against her palms. Every movement was careful, deliberate, unnoticed. She existed at the margins, waiting for the subtle patterns to reveal themselves, the arrogance of the guards, the gaps in the guests' awareness, the vulnerabilities hidden behind laughter and polite conversation. And as the first notes of a distant melody swelled from the musicians, Myra's gaze fixed on a single detail, a guard leaning too far back in his chair, a tray of untouched wine, a flicker of carelessness in the careful dance of the celebration. The storm begins not with a crash, but with a whisper. And beneath the shimmering lanterns, as the laughter and music carried on, Myra felt the quiet tension in her chest solidify into resolve. The night was alive, and soon, so would the reckoning she had been silently crafting. The corridor outside the grand hall was narrow, dimly lit by flickering lanterns that cast trembling shadows along the stone walls. The music from inside throbbed faintly like a heartbeat that did not belong to Myra, yet pulled her forward. Her footsteps were quiet, deliberate, absorbed by the thick carpet that muted the sound of her presence. Every corner she passed seemed to watch her, every whisper of wind through the ancient windows pressing her toward a decision she had already begun to understand. She paused before a small cabinet, her fingers brushing over the smooth wood. Inside lay the pouch she had prepared earlier, filled with finely ground herbs capable of inducing deep, dream-heavy sleep, not deadly, not destructive, harmless to the body, but sufficient to command attention in a world that had rarely listened to her. Her hands hovered over it, trembling not with fear, but with the gravity of what she was about to do. This is not vengeance, she reminded herself, each breath shallow and deliberate. This is reflection. She thought of the marketplace, the loaf, the public disgrace, the laughter of the indifferent crowd. She thought of the kitchen, the whispers, the casual cruelty of the guards. And she thought of Sarah's words, which now felt alive inside her chest. Storms can cleanse, yes, but they can also destroy. Let it awaken, not annihilate. Myra lifted the pouch carefully, holding it against her chest as if it were a fragile fragment of her own soul. The faint scent of crushed herbs drifted upward, earthy and sweet. She imagined the ripple of stillness it could bring, a pause in the unthinking motion of the manor, a breath of clarity that might allow the indifferent to feel their own emptiness for just a moment. The hall door loomed ahead, wide and luminous. Through it she could see the glow of lanterns, the shimmer of gowns, the subtle chaos of preparation for the wedding feast. Guests moved as if the world were theirs entirely, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering in the shadows. Myra exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She knew the act she was about to perform carried no malice. It would not harm, nor punish in the way cruelty demanded. It would simply interrupt, shift perception, and force a moment of reflection. That was all the justice she required tonight, awareness, not destruction. Myra stepped into the hall with the pouch held tightly, her shadow stretching across polished floors. She moved among the servers, adjusting trays and guiding small arrangements, every action deliberate, every glance calculated. She felt the rhythm of the room, the lapses of attention, the arrogance of those who assumed no one could touch them. Finally, she approached the center of the feast hall, unseen by the guests, preoccupied with laughter and conversation. Her fingers opened the pouch, letting a fine dust slip into a steaming pot of broth. The scent was gentle, almost imperceptible. The world continued around her, unaware, but subtly shifted. She had inserted her presence, her power, without causing harm, without raising a voice. Myra stepped back, watching the pot steam, feeling the weight of her decision settle into her chest. Patience and subtlety were her allies. The storm she had prepared would move without a sound, and yet its impact would be undeniable. For a long moment she simply stood, quiet, absorbing the glow of lanterns and the soft hum of music. In that silence, she felt a shift within herself, a clarity she had not known in years. The moment was hers, though the world would not notice until it could no longer ignore her. And as Mara slipped back into the shadows of the hall, the faintest tremor of the storm she had quietly summoned pulsed through the Mandarin scene, inevitable and impossible to deny. True power often arrives quietly, unnoticed, until it reshapes everything in its path. The hall was alive with light and laughter, but Myra moved through it like a shadow, her presence unnoticed, her breath steady. Music swelled and faded, glasses clinked, and conversations drifted like smoke above polished tables. No one observed her. No one suspected the quiet force she carried in her hands. The tray she had set aside held a small pot, simmering gently, the surface rippling with the steam of her subtle intervention. Myra's eyes scanned the room, noting the positions of the guests, the movements of the servants and the watchful stance of the guards. Each detail mattered, where a tray teetered, where a glance faltered, where arrogance betrayed a lack of awareness. She moved with precision, her hands brushing the pot's rim, adding the finely ground herbs that would bring a temporary, harmless stillness to the room. This is not revenge, she reminded herself, letting her pulse slow. This is reflection, awareness, a pause in their careless rhythms. The first faint effects were almost imperceptible. Guests mid-conversation leaned slightly against chairs as if the world had become softer, more fluid. Eyes fluttered, lids heavy with the weight of sudden, dreamlike lethargy. Laughter faltered, not in panic, but in gentle suspension. Myra felt her own heartbeat slow in response, a quiet empathy for the shift she had orchestrated. The guard, the one who had sneered at her in the marketplace and mocked her in the great hall, slumped forward slightly in his chair, a moment of vulnerability exposed without cruelty. Myra's chest tightened, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of the balance restored, however briefly. Power had shifted in the gentlest possible way, and the arrogance that had once seemed untouchable now wavered. Myra moved silently among the guests, ensuring her intervention was precise, leaving nothing to chance. The hall's light shimmered on polished surfaces, highlighting silver trays, floral arrangements, and the subtle tremor in the hands of those who could not fully account for the sudden calm that had descended upon them. No one cried out, no one suffered. Only awareness, subtle but undeniable. Her mind returned to the marketplace, to the 200 strokes of humiliation, to the stolen loaf, to the laughter of indifference. All of that had been endured, all of that had shaped her. And now, in this quiet act, she had transformed the helplessness of her past into a presence that could no longer be ignored. She paused at the edge of the hall, watching as the room moved in slow, dreamlike suspension. The guests' conversations fell into gentle murmurs, their movements softened, as if time itself had bowed to the weight of observation. Myra allowed herself a small, controlled exhale. The storm she had carried in her chest, patient and silent, had begun to ripple outward. Her eyes met Lord Hadron's briefly across the hall. Shock flickered in his expression, tempered by confusion. His world, which had always demanded obedience and silence from those beneath him, was momentarily unbalanced. Myra did not look away. No words were needed. The subtle clarity of her actions spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. She straightened her shoulders and took a slow step back, blending once again into the periphery of the hall. Every heartbeat, every breath, carried the resonance of quiet authority. She had acted. She had shifted the course of perception without harm, without spectacle, and the echoes of her choice had already begun to shape the consciousness of the room. And as the lanterns flickered and the music hummed on, Myra felt the invisible tremor of her storm pulse through the hall, silent, deliberate and irreversible, leaving the world she had endured to finally awaken, however briefly, to the weight of her presence. Awareness can be a quiet storm, arriving without warning, leaving those who once ignored it trembling in its wake. Dawn crept slowly through the stained glass windows of the great hall, painting fractured patterns of colored light across polished floors. The warmth of early sunlight softened the edges of shadows, but the room still carried the residue of the night's subtle upheaval. Myra moved through the hall with the same quiet precision as before, Her footsteps measured, her eyes absorbing every detail. The guests, once vibrant and laughing, now stirred with a sluggish, dreamlike confusion. They blinked, stretched, murmured softly to themselves, unsure of what had touched them in the night. The transformation was not cruel, no screams, no panic, but it was undeniable. Every face held the faintest trace of reflection, a pause that demanded they sense the world differently, even if only for a moment. Myra watched the ripples of understanding spread slowly, like sunlight through fog, illuminating fractures in their perception. Whispers began to rise among the guests. I don't remember walking here. My head feels light, like a dream I cannot place. This night, it feels different somehow. Myra allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, not pride, not vengeance, but clarity. The world had never paused for her. Tonight, it had no choice. Lord Hadron approached, eyes narrowed, his face tight with disbelief. He had felt the shift, the subtle rearrangement of his household's rhythm, the unexpected vulnerability in those he commanded. "Myra," he called, his voice tight. "Explain this." "What have you done?" Myra's gaze met his, steady, unwavering. "Nothing harmful," she said softly. "Only reflection." He frowned, confusion etched in every line of his face. The arrogance that had once allowed him to dismiss her existence faltered under the weight of the truth. She had reminded the hall, and by extension him, that the smallest presence could hold quiet authority, that silence could speak louder than command. The guests continued to murmur, a chorus of half-formed thoughts and fleeting realizations. Some reached for explanations. Some looked to the walls and ceilings, seeking reason in the architecture. None could identify the force that had moved them, but all felt its effect. Myra understood this power was most effective when invisible, its presence known only through the shift it caused. She moved closer to the center of the hall, her presence now acknowledged, but still controlled, still measured. "You could have caused chaos," she said to Lord Hadron, her voice calm. "But you never taught respect, you only taught obedience. This is the lesson they will carry." The hall fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by soft, uncertain laughter and the shifting of chairs. Myra allowed herself to observe, noting the subtle change in posture, the tentative eye contact, the way conversations paused before restarting. Awareness had been seeded, and with it a fragile understanding. Elora, standing nearby, watched her with wide eyes. Myra's earlier encounters with her gentle curiosity now seemed like distant echoes, replaced by the recognition of presence and consequence. Even those who had once ignored her, overlooked her, were now, in some small way, attentive. Myra felt the weight of the storm inside her chest, steady, persistent, no longer silent. It had moved through the hall, shaping, awakening, and leaving traces of awareness behind. She did not gloat. She simply observed, the quiet architect of a revelation no one could dismiss. And as sunlight poured across the hall, illuminating the aftermath of her subtle reckoning, Myra understood a truth that had been hers all along. The quietest voice, carried with precision, can awaken even the most indifferent hearts, and the world will never forget it. Some walls hold memories, and some memories demand to be acknowledged before the stones can rest. The morning air had shifted, cool and damp, carrying the lingering mist from the manor gardens into the hallways. Myra walked quietly through the corridors, her steps measured, aware of every creaking floorboard beneath her. The night's subtle storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in every shadow, in every corner where laughter had once been uninterrupted by reflection. The manor itself seemed to breathe differently, as if acknowledging the presence of someone who had long been invisible. Servants moved with a softer caution, glances fleeting toward her as if sensing the authority that no one had dared to give her before. Their eyes no longer carried the weight of indifference. Curiosity, respect, and hesitation hovered in the spaces between their steps. Myra noted each nuance, understanding that the world she had endured was beginning to shift not by force, but by awareness. In the great hall, tables remained set, polished silver catching the pale morning light, flowers tilting gently in the breeze from open windows. Guests lingered, murmuring among themselves, recalling dreams that had felt real, shadows of realization tugging at their memories. Myra could see it in the slow movements, the pauses mid-step, the subtle reorientation of posture. The invisible threads she had woven through the night were settling, embedding themselves quietly in the minds of those who had never considered her existence. She passed the kitchen where Sira stood by the hearth, eyes warm and knowing. The older woman nodded once, imperceptibly as Myra's gaze met hers. "The storm has moved as intended," the nod seemed to say. Myra allowed herself the smallest exhale, the tiniest acknowledgement of the patience and restraint that had guided her. Even the guards, once confident in their power, now hesitated. Their casual arrogance had been softened, their vigilance subtly reshaped by the unseen shift Myra had enacted. She watched them from the corridor, her expression calm, measured, but her mind alive with the quiet satisfaction of precision. This was the first time she had acted without being seen, not to hurt, not to humiliate, but to awaken. The manor stones themselves seemed different. Sunlight streaming through high windows caught on carved details, dust motes drifting in ethereal swirls. Myra walked slowly, touching the walls with her fingertips, feeling the cold stone pulse faintly, as if recognizing her presence. Each corridor, each chamber, each corner of the house had been marked by her quiet storm. The manor was breathing not in its usual indifferent rhythm, but in a rhythm she had helped awaken. She paused in the central corridor, letting her eyes travel across the hall doors, the stairways, the windows. The world she had endured for so long, the world that had punished hunger, ignored suffering, and demanded silence, had now shifted subtly in her presence. Awareness had replaced cruelty, reflection had replaced oversight, and the silent authority she carried was now palpable. Myra breathed deeply, feeling the weight of patience, strategy, and quiet power settle into her chest. She had acted, observed, and waited, and in doing so had begun to reclaim a voice long denied. The manor would never forget the presence she had etched into it tonight. Neither would the people who inhabited its walls. And as Myra turned to leave the central corridor, the manor seemed to sigh in acknowledgement, the walls themselves carrying the memory of her quiet storm impossible to ignore, impossible to erase, and quietly, irrevocably hers. Some victories arrive without fanfare, felt not in shouts but in the trembling silence they leave behind. The first light of dawn crept through the high windows of the manor, spilling pale gold across the polished floors and reflecting off the scattered silverware from the previous night's feast. Myra walked slowly, her shadow stretching along the stone corridors like a quiet witness to everything that had transpired. The air was heavy with the residue of whispered realizations, of small awakenings that could not be unseen. The manor seemed different not just because of the subtle shift she had imposed, but because she herself had moved within it, quietly reshaping its rhythm. She paused at the top of the staircase, looking down into the hall. The guests had departed, some still murmuring about the strange heaviness they had felt during the night, the fleeting dreamlike pauses that had disrupted the ordinary flow of their celebrations. Guards and servants alike moved with careful attention, a lingering awareness that something invisible yet undeniable had passed through their midst. Myra allowed herself a small exhale, the first genuine release of breath in what felt like a lifetime. Her eyes drifted to Elora, standing at the far end of the hall, alone for the first time. The young woman's gaze met Myra's, wide and thoughtful, as though recognizing not only the presence of her unseen intervention, but also the courage behind it. Myra's lips curved slightly, not in joy, but in acknowledgement of a silent understanding. The world could be altered without violence, and justice did not always arrive as fury. Sometimes it whispered. She descended the staircase slowly, each step deliberate, carrying the invisible weight of every slight, every indignity, every unspoken humiliation she had endured. The echoes of her past marketplace sneers, the 200 lashes that had marked her, the hunger and dismissal mingled with the soft morning light, creating a strange balance between pain and purpose. It was in this balance that she found clarity. The manor itself seemed to respond to her presence. The walls, once indifferent, now carried the memory of her quiet storm. Tapestries shifted gently in the morning breeze, flowers leaned toward the sunlight, and even the polished floors reflected her calm authority. The world, though unchanged in structure, had shifted in awareness. A single presence, patient and precise, had reshaped perception without cruelty, without spectacle. Myra moved to the great hall and rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table. Her gaze traveled over the remnants of the night, the empty dishes, the slightly wilted flowers, the soft imprint of footsteps across the polished zones. Everything bore the faintest trace of her intervention, the quiet authority she had exercised with restraint and intent. She had acted without malice, yet with unmistakable consequence. A deep stillness settled over the manor, a weight that was neither oppressive nor forgiving. It was the stillness of acknowledgement, the recognition that even those long ignored could shape the world around them. Myra felt her chest swell with a quiet sense of completion. She had transformed humiliation into agency, invisibility into influence, suffering into subtle justice. And as the sunlight reached its zenith, casting fractured patterns across the silent hall, Myra stepped into the corridor of shadows, knowing that though the world may never name her, the echo of her quiet storm would forever linger unseen, unbroken, and impossible to forget.